Hey folks, hot on the heels from the previous video, today we're going to be taking a look at what I guess could be considered two of the more controversial GTX cards that Nvidia has released over the past few years and seeing how they stack up against each other, since both cards can now be had for roughly the same price on the used market. I'm of course talking about the GTX 970 and the GTX 1063GB. Now I'm sure by this stage you're going to know why the 970 was controversial. Advertised as a 4GB card on a 256-bit bus and subsequently found out to only have 3.5GB of usable VRAM on a 224-bit bus, with the final 512MB being attached to a snail-like 32-bit bus. This led to Nvidia having to settle a class action lawsuit over false advertising, and it was a fly in what was otherwise a pretty tasty suit, even by today's standards, as the GTX 970 it still holds up quite well in games, and it's an absolute gem to overclock with 10% plus gains being fairly commonplace. With this MSI gaming card and thanks to GPU boost, we see the boost clock settling in around 1350MHz before overclocking, and can push the card to settle in around 1525MHz when overclocked. The VRAM can also be overclocked and pushed to a solid 7.4GHz effective speed, up from the stock 7GHz effective. Now the 3GB version of the 1060 also caused up a bit of a stir when it was released, as despite being based on the same GPU as its 6GB brother, it's not simply a lower memory version of that card. No, instead of featuring the full 10SM layout as we see on the 6GB card, which offers up 1280 cores, the 3GB card knocks off 10% of these, dropping the SMs down to 9 and the resulting core count down to 1152 cores, as well as a drop in TMUs down from 80 to 72. Now the problem with the GTX 1063GB is just the naming, fooling punters into thinking that it's the same GPU as the bigger brother 6GB version. It caused a bit of a bitter taste in the mouth for many buyers. Now Nvidia could easily have skipped round this by calling the 1066GB the 1060 Ti, but they didn't, and what resulted was a GPU that often got a lot more criticism than perhaps it was due. Still, with a stock boost speed settling in over 1900MHz, it is a bit of a flyer. And when overclocked, the 1063GB here settled in at just over the magical 2GHz number. At stock, the memory of the 1063GB comes in at 8GHz effective speed, but it can be pushed to around 9.2, which does help with memory bandwidth as the 1060 series uses a 192-bit memory interface. But what about performance? Which one of these green team mongrels comes out on top at the end of 2018? Well, there's only one way to find out, so let's see if fewer faster cores on the GTX 1063GB manages to outpace the slower but higher quantity cores in the GTX 970. First up, we've got Far Cry 5 on the high preset with TAA enabled. And as you might have seen in the previous video, the GTX 970 turns in a fairly strong performance here at stock speeds, with its average being above 60fps and the 1% lows being above 50. And when we overclock it, the 970 almost manages to hit 60fps on the 1% lows, and it's a great card to game on. The newer architecture and higher boost clocks on the 1063GB however puts in a fairly convincing win at stock, although the gap does close up a little when we compare the overclocked results, as there's a lot less headroom on the Pascal GPU for overclocking when you compare it to Maxwell. Rise of the Tomb Raider now at 1920 by 1080 on the high preset, and this continues the close theme of the previous test, with both cards hovering around 90fps on average at stock, with the 1060 pipping the 970 on average, but with the 970 returning slightly better 1% low results. It's fairly margin of error stuff though, and when overclocked, the 970 does return better averages and 1% lows. It's still to the tune of a few FPS though, and negligible when actually playing. The newly released Shadow of the Tomb Raider now at 1080p on the high preset, and again there's no real discernible difference between the two cards. At stock clocks, neither the GTX 1063GB or the 970 managed to hit 60fps on average, and when overclocked it was again much of a muchness. If I were going to be pedantic here, I could say that the 1063GB performed better in stock form, while the 970 took the lead when overclocked, but really at these margins it would be too close to call. And now for a game that does actually split the two cards a bit, the newly released Forza Horizon 4, running at 1920 by 1080 on the medium preset. Here, and even at stock speeds, the GTX 1063GB manages to open up a considerable lead over the 970, with an average frame rate over 100 FPS, compared to the 970's averages in the low 90s, with a similar gap in the 1% lows. The 970 does manage to pull back some of that difference with its fantastic overclock ability, but even with the overclock applied, the 1060 3GB is still just slightly out of sight by a few frames, and when we overclock that, it just opens up the gap further. Finally, Battlefield 5, and here the cards are much closer matched at 1080p on the Ultra preset. At stock speeds, the 1060 manages to eke out a win on average by a single frame, but it did actually return 1% lows which were consistently higher than the 970. Overclocking the 970 sees the 1% lows leapfrog the GTX 1060 and pushes the average frame rate to almost 70. Overclocking the 1060 doesn't achieve the same boost to the average FPS, but its 1% lows did nearly jump to 60 FPS. Both cards here performed really well though, considering this is a newly released title and at the Ultra preset. So a really close battle all in all then, and the 1060 3GB just pipping the 970 on aggregate thanks to that Forza Horizon score. Although as you can see by the aggregate overclocked results, it's pretty much identical for both. So there's really not much between the two cards, and you're going to be extremely happy with either at 1080p. If I were to pick one, I guess at this point in time I would probably sway towards the GTX 1060 3GB, for two main reasons. Firstly, it does actually draw a bit less power. The Gigabyte model I've used here uses a single 6-pin PCIe power connector, compared to the MSI 970's 8+6 arrangement, which is handy if you've got a lower wattage PSU. And the lower power draw does actually push out a little bit less heat as a result. Even though the 970, it's still a really cool card. Secondly, and I guess this is to do with the image of the card, and how that's actually impacted prices on the used market. The 970, while being a bit controversial on release, it's sort of become a bit of a cult hero, and deservedly so in my opinion, but unfortunately this cult hero status seems to push up the prices a little. The 1060 3GB on the other hand is the 1060 that no one wants, and the sheer volume of these cards on sites like eBay means that prices at the moment are driven right down, often coming under the price of the more desirable 970s like the MSI gaming version I've got here. The combination of these things, availability, price and performance, means that the 1060 3GB is a great buy. It's not flawless, but as a budget card it's going to do you fine, and I guess it would be my choice between the two if I were buying one today. Going forward, the 3GB of VRAM on the 1060 might become a little bit restrictive as to what settings you could run, but the grunt of that little Pascal GPU should mean that you're able to chew through games at settings tailored for 3GB, with very high frame rates for a fair while yet. But it will really just depend on the prices in your local area. If one card, for example, is considerably more expensive than the other, simply choose the cheaper one. As you've seen by the aggregate results, they perform really similarly on the whole. But I'd honestly love to know what you are thinking of this, if you could be swayed by the 3GB 1060 compared to a cult hero like the 970, or if having the stigma attached to having the bad 1060 just put you off it. And I guess I'm going to leave it there for today. As always, thank you for watching this video. I'd love to hear what you think of these cards and which one you would pick. And remember to use those thumbs and consider hitting that subscribe button and the little bell icon to get notified when the next video goes live. For now though, take care, and I'll see you all in the comment section down below, and in the next video.